All right, so the financial panic of 1893, the U.S. is in a bit of a problem here. The unemployment is, quarter of the population across the board. Fifth of the population in some areas, way much closer to a third of the population in some major cities like New York, especially focused on, unskilled labor. Things dry up for manufacturing people that just, don't have that fill the certain lower rung roles, and they get hurt the worst, which is really unfortunate. And so over 1893, 1894, you see a pretty sharp decline. If you're looking at a chart, you often see a real sharp decline at first, and then the getting back to normal discussion that is going to be a bit slow. So you go from 1894 all the way to 1898, and that is the time period that you see the recovery. So it takes about till 1898 for the country to get out of it. So that's kind of the discussion that's happening now with the current crisis, with the unemployment that's happening with the response to the lockdown due to the disease. And we know the U.S. isn't seeing the effects just yet, as far as as a whole in the economy, but we will see it. And the question is, how is it going to act? We've had a real stark decline. This is the steepest rise in unemployment we've ever seen by far, even compared to this or the Great Depression. Nothing compares to the steepness of the unemployment caused by the lockdown. The extent of the unemployment, we don't know yet. We're already looking at, this is, the first third of April here, we're already looking at 12-ish percent unemployment. And some people are saying 25-30% is not out of the question, depending on how long, lockdown goes and all that. And so, and the other side of that is, how is that going to affect, the economy? And, so this, with markets and everything, and GDP, you're going to see a pretty steep decline. And the other question is, what is it going to look like on the other side? Is it going to be a very rare occurrence where you have just sort of like a V, where you have a sharp decline, but then we kind of get back to normal? Or is it going to be much more gradual, where you go down and then it looks kind of like this, where you have a fairly sharp decline, and then it takes 4+ years to get back to normal? It's hard to say what it's going to look like, but we can look back at these events like 1893. We call it financial history, and that sounds really dull sometimes, but you can learn from these and look at, and you can't find a perfect comparison, but we can learn lessons from it. And how do people react? That's one of the biggest lessons, because people never change really when it comes to how they act during crises. And so we'll have to see. 20 years from now, we'll be talking about this crisis and how the U.S. got out of it, and that's going to be something to pay attention to. And so, for your own sake, and for the sake of your kids and their kids, pay attention. They can learn lessons from it as well. So just keep that in mind going forward. And so, as I said, one of the major effects of this was that you're going to be seeing a shift in political wins, because people, this started at the beginning of Grover Cleveland's second term and is going to go all the way through that term. And that becomes sort of the highlight of his second term for him, unfortunately. And at the end of that, we're going to get to 1896 is when the election is going to happen. This panic is going to, or the effects of this panic is going to be felt until 1898. And so you're going to see this shift. But the election is interesting. And that's why I mention it. And I don't talk about every election that comes along, but this one is interesting, because you have the campaign of 1896. So here you have McKinley, who I'm sure you can already see who the winner is. If you know anything about U.S. history, you don't know one of the names versus the other. This is going to be McKinley versus Bryan. Populism is going to be in full effect in this particular campaign, represented by William Jennings Bryan here. So some of the success of populism in this particular election, for varying reasons, the farming interest, people who were like the farmers are banding together to, take care of themselves and promote themselves politically, and also the mining interests, both miners and the owners of mines are pushing for some of the same goals, and those are aligned with rural folk, people who start to see themselves as sort of a political body that doesn't exist really anymore. Not as much, not like it did in this case, but they see themselves as the rural versus the city in a lot of ways, because that's the divide that's happening in the country. And so the needs of the rural folk need to be looked after. And one of those is the importance of silver. They wanted they were pushing for silver currency to inflate the economy, making silver the standard because it's more plentiful. And by adding more silver into the economy, they could boost the amount of the value, or the making their money worth more, basically, and would allow them to pay loans and things like that. It's the solidness of the economics behind that aren't great in a lot of ways, but basically they were pushing for silver as the main driver, or the main securer of money in the United States. McKinley, for his part, is much more a mainstream party guy, much more old school in his campaigning, doesn't travel. They do what they call front porch campaigning. That's why I put the picture here of McKinley speaking to reporters and other visitors and representatives. The candidate would stay in one place and other people would travel to them. Bryan represented sort of a new version of campaigner. He was much more active and of the people, and you can see an interesting dichotomy here. I'm sorry, I keep hitting that. The old school versus the new school. Now, if a current day politician acted the way McKinley did here, they wouldn't get very far, because they would be seen as aloof and not concerned about people's lives, and they're not out there kissing babies and shaking hands and all that. So that's one interesting thing about this election, is you start to see this new version of campaign where the campaigner is expected to be active, and it appeals to the average people, because that, they've always been sort of cut off from that world in a lot of ways. Bryan is really, really different. Some of the issues that Bryan is focused on here. One, the silver issue, because that appeals to the farmers and the miners and a lot of other rural folk. He was very much an advocate of the social gospel, very much right there in the middle of the movement to just better America. That's a big issue for him. He is a fan of, or a promoter of, legalizing strikes in business, so labor, helping out labor, taxing the rich, banning corporate campaign contributions, banning liquor. So he has this, in our modern day view, somewhere kind of straddling the fence between progressive and conservative, like conservative morally, but progressive economically, maybe it would be the best way to put it. It's an interesting character. But he was very much, steeped in religious traditions. So he was sort of a preacher who worked as a politician. He had previously served as Secretary of State. Very skilled public speaker. Often could, use that oratory skill and sort of evangelical style to whip crowds into a frenzy, and he really used that to his advantage. And he traveled a lot, crisscrossed the country in his campaign, and knew where his audience was. So he really did focus on the South and the West because they were receptive to his message, and that's going to be where he does the best. But he was one of the first national candidates, and that's why he's worth you being aware of and knowing about, because he's one of the first national candidates to, speak directly to the common folk, like to really say, and champion the common people. That was unique in his regard. And banning liquor, that one is going to come up again later. He was a little bit ahead of the curve on that particular issue. If he had been, a decade or two later, he might have gotten a little bit more traction out of that, because we're heading towards prohibition. But he was a little bit early on that one. But on these other ones, he's very much in the right in the middle on a lot of things. But ultimately, McKinley's campaign is going to be able to paint the William James Bryan campaign as a bit radical, and they are also, again, suffering from the party in power pays the price problem, and so the Bryan campaign is not going to do well between those two things. One, able to say, well, this guy's crazy, these policies are going to be crazy, and also, do you really want the same party that's been in charge during this financial panic and hasn't been able to help us out during this process? Do you really think that they're going to be the ones to continue to help us out? And so the answer is going to be no for a lot of people. And so again, he does well in the South. Bryan does well in the West. And McKinley is going to do well very solidly through the upper Midwest region, and down into Kentucky, West Virginia, over into the Northeast, and that is, with the population density of that area, that's more than enough to secure the electoral vote for 271 to 176, and so McKinley is going to take the election. But it has a very high voter turnout. This was a very popular election, if you want to put it that way. Some 79% of the population, or the voting population, turned out, and so big numbers there, ones that it's hard to imagine at this point. But now, with that election out of the way, and the U.S. is on its way sort of out of the financial panic, then we're in a position where the U.S. is going to be focusing on much more global issues. So over, that we get past this in 1896, the McKinley administration will then take office, and then you're going to see this step towards the U.S. getting involved globally, which is the War of 1898, which we talked about previously. But I wanted to include this so that you kind of have that information, that combo, which is understanding where the U.S. was during all of this. And so it's hard to keep all that exactly chronological, but you can understand how all that fits together. So this is leading up to the U.S. getting involved in the War of 1898. So anyway, I believe that we'll stop there. I wanted to not belabor these particular topics too long, because I'd like for you to take some time with those first two videos, especially because I think they'll really benefit you hearing about The Devil in the White City and Larson's talk on it. I think that's a great one for you to benefit from. So I hope you have a great rest of the week, and we'll catch you a little bit later. All right. Thanks, everybody.